So now we have ensured that recording is also in place. European Union is facing multiple internal and external challenges, and who will lead the Union over the next 5 years will have profound implications, not just for the nature, but also for the future of European integration. Over the last 2 decades, Central and Eastern European member states have been underrepresented in EU top jobs and in EU institutions more widely. And the question to what extent this time things will be different and whether they will be able to shape and influence the agenda for the next 5 years. It's particularly important and interesting, as many have raised questions whether the balance of power within the European Union is shifting east. And this night we'll have an opportunity to reflect on the significance of the allocation of top EU jobs in various institutions, and also what it will mean for the future policy making and EU politics. We have a stellar lineup of speakers, and I'm delighted that they have agreed to join us today. And Mihail, and most of you know him, he's a colleague and friend based at the Department of Politics and International Relations and OSGA here at the University of Oxford. He has worked on legislative behavior, party politics, and the behavior of European Union in Central and Eastern Europe. He has published widely in top journals, and in 2023 received the Impact Award from Oxford Department of Politics and International Relations for his work with the European Parliament Special Committee on the COVID-19 pandemic. And joining us online is Csaky. She's a senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform. Her work focuses on EU institutions, elections, the rule of law, and democracy. She has also covered important developments in Central and Eastern Europe. Before joining the Center for European Reform, she was policy leader at the EUI and research director at Freedom House, overseeing projects on governance, media, and democracy in Europe and Eurasia. And we also have Hussein Kassim. We are very lucky, and we've just discovered that he's back after 13 years here at the European Studies Centre, and wonderful to have him back. He is a professor of European Public Politics and Administration at Warwick, and before that he was based at the University of East Anglia, as well as Nottingham, and of course he started his teaching career here at Oxford and the colleges Balliol, New College and Worcester College. He has worked extensively on EU institutions and has a keen interest in developments in the European Commission regarding leadership coordinations and internal operations. And last but not least, we are very happy to have Kristi Raik joining us online. She's the Deputy Director and Head of the Foreign Policy Programme of the International Centre for Defence and Security, and she's also Professor of International Relations at the University of Turku. She was also Director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, and prior to that served as Senior Research Fellow and Acting Programme Director of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki, as well as the General Secretariat of the Council of the European Union in Brussels. She has published widely on European security, EU foreign policy, including EU's relations with Russia, Ukraine, and the European neighborhood. She has a strong expertise on the Baltic states and Finland. So without further ado, we are going to start our discussions seminar today with Zselyke, and first over to you, a brief overview of some of the latest developments.
Thank you, Eli. Hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. So I would like to divide my remarks into 2 parts. Basically, I would like to just give a brief overview about this lack of representation, to have the facts at hand, and then go into the implications of that, and focus on what role the spoilers have played in this, how they have benefited from this underrepresentation. So this will be less of an academic take. I'm not an academic, but more of a current policy or about current policy and politics. And when I was preparing for this, I did take a look at the most recent numbers, just to have them ready. And according to GRELO, which is this nonprofit initiative, the geographical representation of EU leadership observatory, according to them, in 2024, there was a dramatic worsening when it comes to the representation of Central and Eastern Europe. So just to have the numbers, CEE constitutes around 40% of the member states and 23% of the EU's population. Yet, when it comes to appointments in the last 3 years, people from this region got 6% of these appointments. And in 2023, not a single citizen from Central and Eastern Europe was appointed to a leadership position. Now, this obviously changes in 2024 as we are talking about that. So still, I think, despite the fact that Russia's attack on Ukraine amplified this region's strategic importance for Europe, I would say that at this point, it is still questionable, or at least based on this data, it is still questionable to what extent power is shifting to the east after the war broke out and after Poland and the Baltics really stepped up. Obviously, the dynamics have changed, and I think we can see that the region has played a much more important role in convincing member states to muster a more meaningful response. But it has yet to trickle down into, or rather trickle up and result in positions. And that may be changing this year. But just taking a step back, because I think it's important to state what's needed for these positions, because this is not just the top jobs that we are talking about, but also the Secretary General, so others that perhaps we don't know by name. Obviously, merit and competence are needed, but I don't think the region is lacking that. So I think, and probably the others will talk about this, that the political element to these appointments is very important. Many positions are divided up, for example, between political parties, such as that of the president of the European Parliament, where the Socialists and the EPP have been taking turns for some time. And obviously, in those cases, older member states enjoy the advantage of having a network. Whereas in the case of Central and Eastern Europe, this elite integration is still lagging behind. And so I also looked at the past 15 years and just tried to find the positions filled by, the high-level positions filled by people from the region. I mean, obviously, we know that the head of EUCO was Donald Tusk, who's back in Poland between 2014 and 2019. And then another Pole, Jerzy Buzek, filled the position of the European Parliament president. So those are the two most well-known names. And there is also a Latvian representative who is in the Secretary General of the Commission, Ilse Johansson. So I think just the fact that we can only list so few names shows how far we are behind. And then, obviously, we will be talking today about the High Representative Designate Kaja Kallas. I think Kristi will have some things to say about her. Ironically, I think it was her who highlighted last year this representation gap. So it's interesting that now she is, in fact, the designate for this position. And then just let me say a few words about the Commission, because I know that we will cover that more in depth as well. But just looking at the previous von der Leyen Commission and the current or the incoming one, the situation may not be as bad for the region, because in the previous Commission, out of the 3 executive vice president positions, 2 were filled by people from Central and Eastern Europe, and out of the 3 vice presidential positions, 2 were filled again by people from Central and Eastern Europe. So on paper, this looks like a more balanced setup. And with the incoming commission, I think the jury is still out. This is a new structure. It seems more centralized than the previous one. I mean, if it goes through, the hearings are just taking place, but it seems more centralized than the previous one. There are 5 executive vice president positions, and out of those, only 1 would go to somebody from the region, Mânzatu from Romania. She is commissioner designate for people skills and preparedness. But we still have a few people from the previous commission who are tasked with important roles, such as Valdis Dombrovskis, who is tasked with a follow-up to the Draghi report. So he would be working on Europe's competitiveness. This is definitely a key topic right now. And we also have a new role, the Commissioner for Defense. It's unclear how much power that commissioner would have, but right now it would go to a Lithuanian representative. So I think there are some signs of a growing role for CEE on defense, for example, with the High Representative, with the new Commissioner for Defense. But I think the jury is still out on whether the current commission has people in less or more influential positions from the region. And I think with facts out of the way, just let's talk about the implications a bit, because obviously from a standpoint of fairness and equality, and not to mention equity, this is very problematic. And from the perspective of policy, having few input and having not enough influence for the region on policies that impact the region is highly problematic. But then it also fuels alienation, and it can be detrimental to citizens' trust in institutions. But the third point that I think I would like to talk a little bit more about is that politicians in the region can also exploit this disillusionment or the anger with the lack of catching up, and I'm using air quotes here, I think. That's also an interesting, that's a concept that we can also talk about. But to some extent, this is precisely the reason why Orbán and Fico can rail against Brussels as if it was a separate entity because of this underrepresentation. And I would argue that in some way, the region does punch above its weight, but that is thanks to Viktor Orbán, or has been thanks to Viktor Orbán and his thematization of certain topics like migration. Obviously, with the Patriots, he has also been talking about taking over Brussels. So in that sense, we can't say that the region doesn't have an impact. The question is what kind of impact it has. And with Orbán's symbolism, this is a very destructive role. We know that because it hampers EU decision-making and by using threats and vetoes. But it's also problematic because it further marginalizes Central and Eastern Europe in the long run. And I think if we just look at the upcoming elections, I mean, we have in Slovakia Robert Fico in power right now, and potentially in the Czech Republic, Babiš is in the lead and could be re-elected again next year. So it's possible that we will have another sovereigntist or blocking Visegrad 3 again. And that is a different setup, or perhaps a similar setup to what was before, but a different setup from what we were hoping for after the war broke out. And I think, I mean, one reason behind the region's marginalization has been some version of the East-West divide, that the region favors different values. Obviously, I don't sign up to that argument. But I think if we highlight the actorness of these countries, we need to also do that when they do things that undermine their influence. And this is what has been happening, at least thanks to Hungary and to a smaller extent, Slovakia. And so going forward, can Central Europe play a more meaningful role and influence on policy? If that's the question, I think the question is what happens to Poland. Because right now, with Tusk backing government and with the upcoming Polish presidency, it is clear that that will strengthen Tusk's hand. And this is an opportunity for the Polish government to have meaningful impact. But we shouldn't forget that it's a government that is hampered by internal politics, not just because there is an inconvenient cohabitation, but also because Poland will have presidential elections next year, and there is a coalition in fighting. So all of this undermines the government's ability to focus as much on foreign policy as perhaps it would like to. And I think on Ukraine, we are already seeing the results of that, with relations a little bit soured recently and with long-standing grievances resurfacing. So it's a question to what extent Poland can really play that leadership role. The Baltics, I mean, I will leave that to Kristi and the others. The Baltics may be better placed. And just one closing thought, which is that with enlargement coming up, the reality is that smaller countries' influence will diminish if and when unanimity is replaced by qualified majority voting, and that's a big if, obviously. But in some sense, the balanced representation of Central and Eastern Europe is even more important to figure out to take place before that happens. So let me just finish on that and thank you.
Excellent and wonderful start. Thank you, Zselyke. And now we will move on to Hussein to tell us a little bit more about the European Commission.
Thanks. I'm not quite sure how this is going to work with the slides, but let's see anyway. Obviously, I agree with everything that's been said about the sort of normative dimension of this. It's really important for the Commission, for representative democracy reasons, to have people from all over from all member states present in, not only for sort of reasons of representation, but also for sort of technical expertise. I mean, I remember an interview saying to me once, well, who else is going to be able to handle Latvian state aid other than a Latvian? We need that person in our team, that sort of those languages, we need narrative and legal and consistent. I think that the Commission is the bright spot. I'm going to take a slightly longer historical perspective than speaker just now. It's the top study, I think, that she mentioned. But this is urgent and is present, and that these are sort of 3 reports done on the underrepresentation, particularly of Poland and Hungary. And one of those letters, one of these is actually a letter that's directed towards Serafin as he goes into his hearings on the 7th of November. Will he promise to do something about this issue? So I'd like to talk a bit about that. So I want to show you some figures and talk through those things. So we've already mentioned that there are a significant number of commissioners in sort of key perspectives, in key portfolios, and that really matters. And this is the first indication, I would say, that this is not only about numbers, it's also about positions. Okay, and individuals are also important. I'll come back to that in a moment, but this point has been made, so I'm not going to make it again. But if we look at the 4 commissions that in practice have been appointed, 4 that have been appointed, one that's about to come about. I'm conscious now that no one can see this, but this meticulously crafted table tells you that under the first 2, Barroso was pretty. How can I put this? There were not very many Central and Eastern Europeans in top positions under Barroso. Okay, under either Barroso Commission. That's what this is showing you. So the upper reaches of the table show you EVP, which is a von der Leyen invention, and VP. But as you can see, there are actually four, as the previous speaker said, VPs under the von der Leyen one. The point about the portfolios is that what I did there is I listed every single portfolio that a Central East European Commissioner has had, and the basic story is none of them are very significant until you get to energy, and then you come to the new Commission. So, I mean, Šefčovič, for example, has got trade and economic security. This is a big thing, okay? And just to sort of illustrate that, again, I'm not sure how much of that you can see, but what I did here was to sort of highlight here are the defence portfolios, so three commissioners from Central East Europe in those roles, and also, this is a PDF rather than PowerPoint, but there are two who have key economic roles. One is obviously Zselyke, who I mentioned before, in a different context of administration, but also is responsible for budget. The other is Šefčovič again. So, yeah, there are at least 5 commissioners, I would argue, who are in very significant positions. Yes, one has to bear in mind that this is a very centralised, presidentialised commission president. Okay, I would argue the most centralised or presidential ever. But let me just hang that in front of you and talk any more about that at the moment. And we don't know what's to come. But the talk is that the next time we'll be more centralised. So one of my themes is beyond the numbers. So I'd argue that Mihail has been a very influential commissioner, Slovakian socialist, who has played a number of key roles in the Barroso Commission, under the Juncker Commission, and under von der Leyen. Really significant. Here's his CV. These are serious positions. And remember that he was promoted from VP to EVP to manage the Green Deal under von der Leyen. He's handled other sort of major sort of issues previously, but he's clearly seen as a safe pair of hands, good negotiator. Significant, I think, that he's occupied these positions, even though he doesn't come from the EPP like most of the recent Commission presidents. We mentioned Dombrovskis, so I'm not going to mention him. But I just want to say that I agree fully with the first speaker's argument that it's important to have people in key positions. And you have, in this very presidentialized commission, which governs the commission through the Secretariat General. The Secretary General is a Latvian. Okay, and also Johansson, she occupies a tremendously important position and is an intellectual figure. What I want to also to emphasise is, I also agree that administrative leadership is key in this institution. Okay, 32,000 officials. This is the institution at the centre of EU decision making. You might argue, and it's been very conscious about representation from the very start. This is the this is the exercise that it undertook from 2000, apart from the Polish Commission, actually, to try and ensure that there was representation from the new member states. And it's a really interesting document. This is a reflection of 2011, talking about how what the targets were, how this compared with previous enlargements, where the successes were and where the failures were. But what's really interesting about this is that the Commission overshot its targets when it was recruiting from the member states that joined in 2004 and 2007. But there is a caveat. Okay, so this is the first of, depending on how quickly I can get to the end of the presentation, whether that falls within this limit or not. This is the first of several diagrams I'm going to show you which show proportionality. Okay, so in Commission speak, this is proportionality by the strict arithmetical method. That's the language used in the really landmark document 2019. What this shows is that where 0 is the point where a member state is represented by the number of nationals that is absolutely aligned with its share of the EU population. Okay, so you'll see on the blue side, these are all countries that are overrepresented according to that metric. On the right-hand side, all those that are underrepresented according to that metric. And you can see there are only 2 Central and Eastern European countries. Okay, there's the Czech Republic, Czechia, and Poland. But Poland is dramatically underrepresented. The other interesting thing about this is, of course, the UK is even more dramatically or radically underrepresented. but the larger member states are all out there. So this informs another sort of another line of argument I want to introduce here. We're also talking about small states, and we're talking about which are generally overrepresented. We're also there's a particular problem with larger member states that which Poland is one. So when we're thinking about Poland, it's not only Poland; it's a larger member state which, to some extent, is aligned with France, Germany, and that former member state. Okay. Now the Commission knows this. In 2018, as somebody who's watched Commission personnel policy develop over a long period and done many sort of interviews about this as part of several projects, this 2018 ComDoc is an amazing document. This is the first time I've ever seen the geographical balance spoken about openly, calculated in different ways. But the key message from this is that in the senior range of positions, posts, it is the post-2004 member states that are underrepresented. Okay, so we're talking sort of middle managers to senior managers. Okay, but notice, and I say this sort of in parenthesis, I think it's really important to understand this. In more junior levels of the staff in the Commission, it's the pre-2004 member states that are underrepresented. Okay, now that's a problem. Both are a problem, but I think it's really important to put the Central and Eastern European underrepresentation in this kind of global perspective. And this is for the real sort of nerds amongst us, and of course I'm a prime nerd in this respect. But this just sort of maps levels of seniority. It's a bit fluid because there's middle senior managers. It's not post isn't absolutely tied to grade, but this is just intended as a key. What's happened in 2022 was that the Commission decided it was finally going to take action on underrepresentation. This is you find it on the website, and you'll see that what's happened is that the Commission, this was largely to Oettinger's initiative. Because you have to do something about general underrepresentation. They decided to sort of look at the whole range, look at who was underrepresented, to devise plans to try and overcome this, and to devise plans with the member states concerned. So if you go to this website and sort of look down, you'll see a list of the countries that are being addressed, and there will be all Central and Eastern European countries too. Okay, I haven't got this diagram in here with me, but one of the things that I've actually shown to EPSO and around the Commission a number of times is the different pathways that different member states take, that nationals from different member states take into the Commission. And it is fascinating because it is various and challenging. And so if you're sitting there in Brussels, it's really hard to think, what do I need to do along each of those pathways to encourage more people to arise? What this is showing you is that there's more ADs, more policy officers in actually virtually every single one of the Central and Eastern European countries. There are more ASTs than ADs and ASTs. So more policy officers than there are sort of people playing sort of support administrative roles. Okay, that's important because what we're not talking about is a kind of underclass, if you like, in the organisation. And so language which uses that kind of terminology is problematic and wrong. This is intended to show you this chart is that things are getting better. Okay, progress is slow. Think about the mechanics of changing representation in a permanent career service, in a civil service with a permanent career service model. Okay, what are you going to do? You can't just chuck people out of the organisation and replace them with new recruits. You've got to bide your time. So progress is inevitably going to be slow. You might say too slow, but what this shows is between 2014 through 2018 to 2024, using the Commission's statistical policy on this, is an improvement. Is more Central Eastern Europeans moving into those into the senior roles. The big exception is Poland, and that's repeatedly shown on these, showing you policy officers, ADs and ASDs, assistants, shown in senior, middle, and management, and shown crucially at Director General level. Now I've completely lost control of my presentation. But this is to show you again, so I showed you the 2018 diagram, but just to emphasize how things get better. you can see on the disproportionality. Sorry, what am I talking about? This is looking at the council secretariat. The council secretariat, the story of representation is sort of kind of similar to that in the commission. The council secretariat is a bit meaner with its data. It doesn't tell you about breakdowns. You have to really work hard to find. So I can't tell you about per grade. But you can see again, we have another variation on the theme. Poland is underrepresented, but it's alongside Italy, France, and Germany. Okay, a bit of advertising. I've done 3 major research projects into operation of the Institute of Research, have access, have data. We surveyed all staff. We asked them all kinds of questions about their background, their careers. Did about 200+ interviews in each case. Did focus groups. So accumulated a lot of data. And one of the key themes, because we started in 2008, was what impact has enlargement made. What is the perception of colleagues from Central and Eastern Europe? What is are Central and Eastern Europeans different in some ways from nationals who joined in who were there before? Now I can feel the chair getting tense because I am approaching my time limit. So if you'd like me to talk about this, I suggest you ask me the questions. Are they genuinely different? And I'll give you a sort of taste that they are in some key respects. Thank you.
Excellent. And now we will transition to the European Parliament, and Mihail will tell us all about the exciting developments that have been taking place there.
Okay, so briefly, I'll be talking about the perspective on these things from the European Parliament. I do believe that descriptive representation is important in itself, but the purpose of my talk is to understand how descriptive representation translates or not into substantive representation. So I'm trying to address 2 things with this presentation. So first of all, how have the top jobs been distributed in the European Parliament, and what is the likely policy-making impact of that distribution for the C MEPs? And then second, whether we are likely to see what the literature has observed until now, which is an underrepresentation of Central Eastern European MEPs when it comes to report allocations or rapporteurships, which are really the most important thing when it comes to policy making in the Parliament. So just to refresh your memory a bit, how did the elections play out in June in Central and Eastern European countries? So you see already that you have plenty of small countries in the region which have very few MEPs to elect, and then you have 2 a bit larger countries, especially Poland and also Romania. You can also see that generally the right-wing parties are either mainstream right or radical right or far right have done very well, and the left not so much. Greens are almost invisible, although in some countries they made a breakthrough at these elections. And then you can compare this to Western European MEPs, right? So you see that basically the EPP has done much better in the East. The far right were non-inscript MEPs, so usually also from a very fringe right perspective, are also more numerous in the East and in the West. And you also see that the socialists are losing out in the region compared to Western Europe. And I'm showing this not just for emphasizing that the regions are different, but also for emphasizing that this will matter when it comes to the distribution of the reports and the policy making in the European Parliament, because those are usually controlled by the mainstream groups, right? So maybe you expected me to show you a graph or a picture of the new vice presidents of the European Parliament. I can tell you that 5 of the 14 are from Central and Eastern European countries, but in this talk, I'll concentrate on something maybe other people find a bit esoteric. So committee chair positions and committee group coordinators, because I think they are really important for how policy is done in the European Parliament. So why would committee chairs matter? So they are important for shaping the agenda of the committee. They are now by de facto members of the negotiating team in trialogues that the European Parliament is sending. They also solve this kind of jurisdictional policy conflicts with other committees, and they by de facto receive lots of reports that no one else wants, right? So if we look at the current distribution of committee positions, so there are 20 permanent committees in the European Parliament. 5 of them have gone to Central and Eastern European MEPs this time around, which is basically the largest number ever. If you think about how powerful, prestigious these committees are that the Easterners got, well, at least 2 of them are perceived as important. So the industry, research and energy, and the legal affairs. You could also argue that the agricultural committee is important given the budget that the EU allocates to agriculture. And from a regional perspective, I guess the regional development committee is also matters. And you see that there is more proportionality now. So generally, the share of CE chairs corresponds to that of CE MEPs, but it's not always the case. So it's more the case this term than it was in the past term, for instance. And this has to do also, of course, with how people vote and where these MEPs go and what kind of groups they go, because committee chair positions are still sort of under this kind of cordon sanitaire rules. So still the far right is not allowed to have committee chair positions. So Patriots for Europe and Europe of Sovereign Nation are very offended and upset with that. I think I filed a complaint to the ECG. So this might be the last parliament that is able to have that kind of cordon sanitaire. So in terms of these positions, there is more proportionality. Now, even more interesting distribution of top jobs has to do with this committee group coordinators. So who are these people? They are MEPs, and they organize the work of their delegation, so their European Party group delegation in the respective committee. So that means that they bid on reports. So they can, if they use wisely their points, which are allocated proportionally, they can get their party group, one member, one MEP in that committee to draft a report on the bill. So they have some kind of discretion in sort of deciding how to bid and who to allocate then this report to within the committee. They're also very important in terms of assuring some kind of coherent and cohesive agenda, right? So what the positions of their party group should be within the committee on all these files that the committee deals with, and then also some kind of cohesiveness with files that are discussed in other committees. And finally, they are very important for how voting behavior works in the plenary in the European Parliament. So if the committee group coordinator works in a diligent, efficient manner, they are able then to convince all the members of the national delegation in the committee group to vote in the same way when it comes to the plenary vote. And that sends a very powerful signal to the other members of the party that the experts, those who sit in the committee, are united on this. So they are important for all these reasons. So you see there, I hope you're able to see at least a bit, 9 of the committee group coordinators from the SND. None of them is from Eastern Europe. However, and this took a lot of time to compile. So if you look at all the committee group coordinators, so their number ranges from something from 140 to 160 per term. So there has been increased proportionality. So there are more committee group coordinators who come from Eastern Europe. So you'd say, oh, that's great news. So it means that Eastern European MEPs will have a lot more power in shaping policy in Brussels. Well, I wouldn't rush to that conclusion. Why? So if you look at committee group coordinators, this is something that the journalists from Europe graciously shared with me, you see that Eastern European MEPs are really underrepresented in committee group coordinator positions in the 4 European party groups that really matter in terms of policy making, are the most active in policy making, have the means to shape policy in the parliament. So EPP, SND, Renew, and the Greens. Things would look a bit better if I would add their ECR because of the big Polish contingent there. Now, if you look at it disaggregatedly for the European party groups, the 7 European party groups that are now in the European Parliament and have recently nominated committee group coordinators, you'll see that this kind of diagnosis that I talked about holds, and a lot of very few of Eastern Europeans are committee group coordinators in SND, Green, slightly more, but still under their share in Renew and EPP, and quite a few in these far right groups and in ECR. So what does that mean? In a way, it has to do with what type of priority these groups have, right? So if you look at what MEPs from the far right usually do in the parliament, they don't really do any kind of policy work. They're there to get the resources, get the visibility through discourses and so on. So being a committee group coordinator here won't influence policy that much, right? And then if there are some issues on which at least the European agenda really matters, probably it won't get translated into policy via this channels. So, and then I'll have just 2 more slides on report allocation. So the European Parliament really assigns a lot of power to the MEPs that gets to draft the report on that bill that the Commission has put forward, right? So the so-called rapporteurs are drafting the position of the whole Parliament on the bill. They get to meet experts, are lobbied, and they get to negotiate in trialogue. So there used to be a lot of leeway and autonomy that rapporteurs used to have. They still have some. Now there is a negotiating team from the committee. Still, they are the most important person from the Parliament when it comes to shaping policy on that bill. And there is academic literature looking at how the allocation of reports has changed after the Eastern enlargement. And people have run really fancy statistical models which are able to control for all sorts of things. And they were able to come up with this kind of very strong conclusion, at least for the first 2 terms of the European Parliament after the enlargement, so 2004, 2009, and 2009 to 2014. So after you control for education, experience in national government, in national parliaments, age, all sorts of policy background, occupational background, and so on, it turned out that Eastern Europeans were getting much fewer reports than the Western European MEPs. And in a way, that's natural, right? Because these people are learning also the trade, and they're building the networks and so on. So what has happened more recently, if you look at the 8 European parliaments, so 2014 to 2019, we see that this doesn't show up anymore, this kind of disparity in allocation of reports. When you control for all these aspects, that should matter. However, if you look at what kind of reports MEPs get, you still have a bit more subtle disparity. So Eastern European, Central Eastern European MEPs would get reports on files that are non-negotiated in the Council to trialogue. So usually on shorter and less complicated files. So there is still some kind of disparity in the allocation of reports. And probably this will continue. So I haven't seen data from the last parliament. Probably someone is working on that, trying to publish on that. But my hint would be that this kind of disparity will continue because there are some structural factors at work there, right? So one of them would be this different way in which Central Eastern European citizens vote, right? And the fact that many MEPs, politicians from Eastern Europe choose to affiliate with groups that are either marginal or not very interested in getting reports for their MEPs. It also has to do with these countries being rather small, although Belgium does punch above its weight and so on. And then there might also be a question of different career incentives and structural electoral incentives that politicians from the East have compared to politicians from the West, right? So when you come from a large country in Western Europe that has a federal structure like Germany, politicians are much more used to thinking about their career as a European career, right? It's sort of developing, professionalizing in that kind of role. Whereas for many unitary and smaller states, the national government is the sort of apex, the summit that they want to go back to, right? So this might also play into this kind of different possibility of Eastern European MEPs or their interest in investing time in specializing and becoming really policy specialists and to influence policy in Brussels. So my answer to the questions that I start my presentation with be that there is a relatively closing gap in the allocation of positions, but we should sort of be cautious about saying yes or replying positive to that question, because for the structural reasons that I discussed, the Western European MEPs are still likely to be very much in control of the EP policy making for the time being. And also, of course, this is very broad brush kind of presentation. There is a lot of intra-regional variation and big differences between what kind of positions Polish MEPs can hope for compared to, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 6 representatives from a small country. Thank you very much.
We can have Kristi and yours.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to join this discussion. My approach is a bit different from the previous speakers. I work a lot on EU foreign and security policy, and then my interest in this question of East-West divide in the EU is mainly focused on the question of what is the influence of Eastern member states on the substance of EU foreign and security policy. And that's where I would argue we have seen a clear shift, which has resulted from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22. And so I would like to look at how this happened, like how can we kind of give examples of this increased influence, and especially looking at the case of Estonia. But then also I will argue that while there was this kind of shift in favor of the Eastern member states in the first couple of years of the full-scale war, we can already see to some extent the pendulum swinging back, and it is becoming more difficult, I would say, in the next commission for countries like the Baltic states and Poland to shape EU foreign policy. But before I go more into detail, I would also like to stress that from the Baltic point of view, this whole notion of Central and Eastern Europe has become quite irrelevant, actually, because the countries have developed in their different directions as EU member states. And Estonia, for example, has never been so openly critical of Hungary as it is today. And the relationship could not be worse than it is. And there is the most important reference group for the Baltic states is the Nordic-Baltic group, the Nordic-Baltic 6. Of course, there are still differences between the Nordics as a group and the Baltics as a group of member states, but the coordination among the Nordic-Baltic states is close and regular. And there is potential to do more in coordination among Nordic-Baltic plus Poland under the current Polish government. But I think this has not quite materialized as much as it potentially could. But then again, the Visegrad group is pretty much irrelevant from Poland's perspective today. And when we speak about like substantial influence of the Central and Eastern European member states, then the substance that these countries want to achieve indeed varies a lot when we look at different states. Now, a couple of more words on Estonia's influence on EU foreign and security policy since February 2022. It was this shock of full-scale war that created a kind of new opening for the Baltic states. And then Estonia became the most visible spokesperson, or in particular, it was then Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, who became the most visible spokesperson of that group of countries in matters related to the war in Ukraine. So the visibility of Estonia during the 2 first years of war was, I would say, bigger than it has ever been historically. When you look at kind of international media presence and also the influence that Estonia and the Baltic states actually had on decisions taken in the EU. Of course, there were also limits to the influence. I can give you just some examples. Very soon after the full-scale invasion started, the EU adopted the strategic compass for foreign policy, where the part concerning Russia was actually redrafted in a very short time after the start of the full-scale invasion, because everything had to be reevaluated in light of events. And then suddenly the kind of wording of EU strategy became much closer to the positions of Poland and the Baltic states, notably Russia being defined as the long-term and major threat to European security. Then also Ukraine, Moldova were given the candidate country status, again something that the Baltic states and Poland had been advocating for many years, but now it became reality because of the war. Then, of course, the whole set of sanctions against Russia that the EU adopted in a very unprecedented way were shaped quite a lot by the Baltic states. And the support that the EU has been giving to Ukraine, both military and economic support, again, Estonia has been one of the most active vocal countries in trying to shape the decisions, and it has actually made a difference. Let me mention some cases where the influence has been limited. There was the issue of banning the entry of Russian citizens with Schengen tourist visas in the autumn of 2022, when the airspace had been closed for Russian flights, and that caused a big flow of Russian tourists through the EU countries bordering Russia. So 3 countries, Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. And the numbers were really huge, and it was seen as a security risk in these countries. They banned themselves entry of Russian citizens with tourist visas, but they were not successful in turning this into an EU policy. So there were a more restrictive approach adopted, but not along the position of the Baltic states. Another example was the price cap on Russian oil exports to the EU. That was heavily debated in late 2022 and also later. And there was a compromise reached that then tried to accommodate different views, but Poland and the Baltic states were aiming at a much lower level than what was reached in the end. The compromise was settled at $65 per barrel. A third example would be the joint procurement of ammunition in the EU, which was quite a revolutionary decision again for EU foreign and security policy. It was an initiative made by Estonia in February 2023, and the Commission picked it up, and so the EU took the decision to provide Ukraine with 1 million rounds of ammunition during 12 months. Well, the decision was kind of really significant, but then the implementation has been lagging behind, and the EU actually managed to deliver only half of what it promised during the 12 months. And of course, this is an ongoing issue that will be then also on the agenda of the next Commission, how to strengthen European defense capability, European defense industry. There are conflicting figures about whether the EU today is capable of producing 1 million rounds of artillery per year, or is the figure actually closer to 600,000? But it's a dynamic area where the Eastern member states in particular have a strong interest, and now they will also have positions in the Commission where they can have an influence on this field. One more defense-related issue that has been promoted by Estonia is the Eurobonds for defense, so using common loan for increased defense investment in the EU. A number of countries have supported this, including France and Italy, the Baltics, Poland. But as we know, there are many others, including Germany and the more frugal countries that are opposed. And this is an ongoing debate. I mean, everyone agrees that the need for more defense investment is huge. But then there is no answer to the question, like, where does this money come from? So we will see then what the next Commission will be able to achieve, and to what extent then the Eastern member states who have the strongest interest will be able to shape the policies. Now, I have also looked in my research at the mechanisms of how this influence works. And in the Estonian case in particular, we have seen like successful use of argumentative power in a situation where the kind of status and credibility of Estonia increased. There was demand for the Baltic viewpoint. And then this was then matched by a leader who was kind of capable of being a strong spokesperson. There was, of course, a lot of coalition building, which you always need to do in the EU, but not with the Central and Eastern European group being the relevant one, but Baltic states, Poland, often together with the Nordic countries, and then with various other partners. For example, the Netherlands has been one of the strong supporters of Ukraine, although it's among the most skeptical countries of enlargement. So there are these kind of different groupings. And one very important point has been this kind of successful cooperation with the Commission. So as a member state, Estonia in the past years, when it was making these new initiatives, it really made sure to coordinate well with the Commission. And I would say that was really key to promoting its positions and turning them into collective EU decisions. So looking back, I mean, we can find even more examples, like in 2022, 23, where this influence of the Baltic states was visible. But I think this year, this has already decreased, partly because like so many new major issues were decided during the 2 first years of the war, and then it's difficult to come up with some major new initiatives. Now it's more about kind of better implementation of the sanctions and how to move ahead with the enlargement process and negotiations with Ukraine and other candidate countries. So it's kind of more low-key in a way, and not about coming up with these big new ideas. And then we also see that as the war is dragging on, the old differences among member states on foreign and security policy matters are becoming more visible again. The views on the Russian threat, like how serious or how existential it is for Europe as a whole, how big a priority it should be on the EU foreign policy agenda, is something where we don't really have such a strong consensus as it may be seemed in 2022 and as the Eastern member states would like to have. But it's of course also an important indicator of increased influence of the Baltic states that now we have Kaja Kallas as the designate for the High Representative position, and then the Lithuanian commissioner to become the holder of the defense portfolio. Something like this would have been unimaginable 3 years ago. But now I think it happened as an acknowledgement of the increased relevance of the perspective of the Baltic states in foreign and security policy matters. And in the Eastern member states, other like-minded countries, I think the expectations towards the new high representative are very high, that she would actually bring some new dynamics to EU foreign and security policy and make sure that this kind of strong support to Ukraine continues and a kind of tough position on Russia. But sometimes I'm afraid the expectations are too high when we think about what the powers of the High Representative actually are. So the position is about building consensus among the 27 member states. The High Representative does not decide on EU foreign policy. So a lot of her job is about building consensus and coordinating among member states, also coordinating among the different institutions and among the different commissioners who are doing things relevant for foreign policy. So it's quite different from the position of, let's say, a leader, a prime minister of a member state who goes out and vocally defends the positions of that particular country. And that then remains to be seen how well Kaja Kallas will manage this role of a coordinator and consensus builder. Then, of course, there are questions about whether she might be too focused on issues that are priorities for her own country. I would not be that worried about this question because I think she and her team are very well aware that EU High Representative has a global agenda, and I think she's also capable of learning quickly and realizes that the expectation really is that she has a balanced agenda when it comes to kind of different geographical and thematic priorities. And she doesn't have as strong kind of positions when entering the job on many other issues as she does on Russia and Ukraine, but that might also be actually helpful in building consensus in some of the other dossiers where she doesn't have that sort of bias, so to say. And then when it comes to the limits of this shift in the balance of power, I already said, I think there has been some, to some extent, the pendulum moving back so that the maximum influence was probably reached in 22-23, but that period is now already behind us. And obviously what remains is the kind of structural power in the EU of the largest member states. It's still obvious that you need to be able to work with France and Germany in order to be successful with your initiatives. You need to build larger coalitions, including countries from different parts of the EU. And what then, especially small member states in peripheral location, like the Baltic states, what they can achieve, it's always limited. And that is a challenge then for the Baltic states to be able to build coalitions that go beyond the kind of usual group of Nordic countries and Poland, and to also reach out to other states. And depending on the issue at hand, you also need to be flexible with building a coalition. So to conclude, I think it does matter that there are now positions in the Commission where the Baltic states are strongly represented on foreign and security policy matters and defense. It will make some impact on the future, like substance of these policy fields, but we should not kind of read too much into this. And the previous speakers were focusing on representation. I have focused more on substance, but perhaps a good point to make in the end on my side is that representation does not automatically give influence. So even if the numbers look better, then the countries still need to work hard to actually be able to shape EU policies. I will stop here. Thank you.
Excellent. We've had 4 fantastic and very insightful presentations that have helped us highlight some of the key changes and important developments that have been taking place. And we could argue over the last 2 decades, and obviously representation has improved. This does not necessarily mean that it will automatically translate into influence, but there are important policy areas in which Central and Eastern European countries, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, have played a very substantial role. And on this note, I think that we can open the floor for questions from the audience. If you could introduce yourself first, Othon, and then Dimo.
Thank you very much, Mary. That's been a lot of food for thought there, because there have been so many interesting contributions. I have some general thoughts, if one is to bring all of this together, in the sense that I was just wondering, why does this matter? That we need to know whether, the geographical region of Eastern Europe really is overrepresented or underrepresented. And of course, I do share a lot of points with the last speaker when she says that really, the region is defined in so many ways. And how do we consider Hungary, for instance? Because Hungary is an outlier. And at the end of the day, Hungary is also a very liberal regime. Do we really want this to be represented or overrepresented in positions? And in which direction does, this would take the European Union? But let me ask some specific questions, because I'm also very interested on the impact as well. For instance, the European Commission, why does it matter if, these countries are represented? The European Commission is supposed to be supranational. So what kind of direction would the countries from Central and Eastern Europe give to, the agenda of the European Commission? Similarly, the European Parliament is supposed to be political parties. So what does this tell us about, those rapporteurs and whether they're allocated reports? And one final kind of question has to do with the fact that both Commission and Parliament, again, in the European Commission, the nationals from Central European countries, especially in Csaky, where I was recently, there is this concern that the Czechs are underrepresented because they don't apply for the administrative positions in the European Commission. Why is this happening? And similarly, with the European Parliament, Slovakia has a 15%, a voting presence, is the lowest, close to other Central and East European, in the European elections as well. Is there any kind of, link there in terms of the behavior in Parliament?
Thank you, Othon. Dimo?
Dimitar Bechev, head of the dialogue program here on Europe in a Changing World. A very rich panel. Thank you so much. I'll probably make a comment based on what Kristi said about substance. That's probably the most promising dependent variable if we talk in social scientific terms. What is the impact on substance by those member states, 2004, 2007 for favoring Croatia as well. But I'll encourage you to think about other policy areas beyond Russia and Eastern policy, and those would be the big issues in Europe today. One is certainly competitiveness and the Draghi agenda.
The other one would be green transition, possibly regulation of artificial intelligence. So then the analytical question is, I mean, what is the position if there is one of Central and Eastern Europe? How vocal they are, how salient are those issues? And if there is a position, how much of an impact they have? And if not, what are the reasons? So that's number one. I'll be curious if there's any work where you thought about that in the context of a bigger project. So how those could impact on substance. Second, which also was there in the presentation, the internal diversity of the region. And often echoed that as well. To what extent, depending on each of those issues, you can speak about cohesive focus countries? Or is it the case that there'll be quite a bit of barriers? So, for example, on green transition, you probably can hypothesize that there is a coalition of sorts, which is a negative coalition. You want to delay, you want to block it, but there is a cohesive view from the region. On other issues, they might not have a very strong voice. And on some issues, they'll be divided. So there will be member states there who have something to contribute and others not. So with all those variables around, I was just wondering how you conceptualize impact on substance. And is there a way to go down into the empirical data and come up with some basic mechanisms or paradigms thinking about the region more generally?
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. And then we will pause for some answers and open another round of questions.
Okay, Jonathan Taylor, Zselyke Research Associate and former European official. I spent 5 years as head of delegation in Romania. I think both Othon and Demo have put their fingers on this issue of whether it is right to talk about an East-West divide as such anymore. Post 2004, 2007, there was a lot of discussion about new member states. And of course, nobody has talked about Malta and Cyprus. Malta has actually bagged the role of presidency of the European Parliament, which is not a negligible leadership position. But you know, clearly we are talking about a very diverse constituency, and Kristi has also pointed out that talking Visegrad is in the process of losing its relevance because 3 of them are moving in one direction, 1 of them hopefully is moving in another. And there are also structural barriers. The same you underline the fact that, and when you look at some of the charts you showed us, essentially what you've got is people moving up towards a greater representativity. I don't wholly agree with Othon on yes, the Commission is supposed to act, but I'm just wondering how you do deal with this issue of influence, and are we getting into the sort of situation where the new member states are beginning to evolve in the same way that the older member states have evolved, where it's partly a function of size, partly a function of effectiveness of administration. I think that's also relevant in terms, particularly when you're getting into the influence of member states or indeed MEPs. Are we in effect seeing an evolution towards the same sort of behavior as the older member states? But it's inevitably going to be a progressive evolution, particularly given the significance of the 2004-2007 enlargement, just because that was the biggest enlargement of any of the EU enlargements in terms of population, in terms of GDP, etc.
Excellent, thank you. So we have, I don't know if we want to start in reverse order this time and have Kristi first.
Okay, yes, thank you for the questions. I would like to comment first on this issue of substance and where is it that the Central and Eastern European countries can have influence, and of course we should look beyond Russia and defense, although in the case of the Baltic states and Poland, these are certainly the top priorities also for the next cycle, institutional cycle. I would add enlargement perhaps also, but these are the most important issues. But then if I use the case of Estonia again, which I know best, actually the most important priority for Estonia throughout the membership has been digitalization. And that's an issue where Estonia has been acknowledged as an influential country. It has actually been shaping the EU's digital single market and kind of using its own example of successful digitalization as a way for other member states. And it has been a very conscious choice. For a small country, it's really important to prioritize. You can't be active in many files. You have to be specialized. And this is in particular an area where size does not matter so much. A country can be a relatively big and influential actor even when it has a small size. So not only in the EU, but in every international forum, digital and also cybersecurity have been a priority. And then single market is another one, maybe kind of sounds less sexy, but that's something where small member states tend to be interested in having a well-functioning single market that is like a level playing field for all member states, irrespective of their size. So these are just a couple of issues, but in general, I mean, this is a challenge, I think, for all small member states to think about the priority areas where they can make a difference, and then how to do it, how to find the partners and build coalitions and work together with the institutions, with the Commission in particular, but also with the Parliament. But in my view, this is actually even more important when we analyze this kind of balance of power or shift of power within the EU, to really look at the influence in terms of substance and not just at the figures of representation. But nevertheless, regarding the first question that was posed about, like, why does it matter if countries are represented? Well, we can of course argue that the Commission is supranational and so on, but I don't think any person working high in the Commission in high positions would deny the importance of having different member states represented, even though they are not there to officially to represent their home country, but they do bring the different national perspectives. And it is also hugely important for legitimacy of the EU in the eyes of citizens. So this is going to be one of the tricky issues with the next enlargement. What will happen to the size of the Commission? Of course, there are many other tricky issues, but it has been hugely important for small states to have their own commissioner. And that is a person who is well known in your country and who is kind of breaching then Brussels and the home electorate and helping people to understand what the EU is about and having this sense of ownership. So I wouldn't kind of underestimate the importance, and I think that will be very difficult then for any country to give up its own commissioner. There has to be some kind of solution that then still ensures a sufficient representation. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristi. Mihail?
Yeah, so I'll start with the question comment by Jonathan about the evolution of behavior. Should we expect the new member state politicians to sort of follow the same kind of path like the Western European ones? To some extent, yes, because they are learning on the job and they're building these networks and resources. On the other hand, the political environment that they operate in is a bit more different than the Western European one, right? So think about the kind of electoral volatility levels in Eastern Europe, the kind of incumbent hyper accountability. So governments always lose the election, unless you're Viktor Orban. So this sort of works against the kind of professionalization, at least for the MEPs that we have been seeing in Western Europe. So I guess the response there is really, it depends quite a bit. And this ties in with my response to Autumn. So indeed, there is huge variation to the extent to which the EU is politicized or interesting for citizens in these countries. And of course, some of them are either liberal regimes or tending towards becoming even more so. So in the end, you don't want the representation of that kind of tendencies at EU level or the liberal agenda taking over the EU. So EU really is at a crossroads now, right? Does it develop the anti-corps and does it fight back on the Orban agenda, or will it just become an insignificant player, right? So I think it does matter, and of course this shows also how divided the region is, and that having this kind of inequality in representation or gaps does fuel the kind of rhetoric that Zselyke was also mentioning previously, that some of the liberal actors are using. And then finally, for Dimitar, I think that's really the important question. So do these politicians have really similar or coherent preferences? Are they working together? Are they building coalitions? Does it matter in terms of substantive decisions and policies? So there has been research on the sort of first in 3 parliaments after the enlargement, showing that indeed politicians from the East prefer, for instance, high levels of subsidies. They have similar preferences on regulations. The green transition is also very, very interesting, right? You'd expect that there will be more backlash in the East than in the West, but it's also, you can see the center right pandering to the radical right agenda on trying to dilute the Green Deal and so on. So yes, I mean, these are really the areas where one should come and take this kind of ideas, and what we see in terms of numbers and descriptive representations here, that they actually matter for policy agendas.
Thank you. Thanks, Mihail and Kassim.
There are 4 general points, I think, which come out of the questions. I mean, the first is about representation, and I'll just sort of say again, really, that it's just really important in international organisations, in any bureaucracy or body, to be able to see yourself, to see your representatives, to see people who can talk to you in your language, who can explain things in your language. And what I suggested in my presentation as well, who can deal with practical problems that arise. I mean, if you can, who would deal with, I don't know, sort of water difficulties in Lithuania? If you don't have Lithuanians in the commission who are able to, have the sort of technical knowledge, political knowledge, to be able to manage it. So there's a kind of, basic justice point. There's an input legitimacy point. There's also an output legitimacy point. How can the Commission deliver if it doesn't have the expertise from all across the EU? I mean, there's a balance between achieving supranationality and that's something that we asked in all 3 of our surveys. In fact, do you worry about the geographic balance? And of course, the Commission has many sort of procedures and structures which mean that no single place is sort of colonised by nationals from a particular place. The recognition of the expertise is there. I mean, I suggest an argument by analogy as well. I mean, I do a lot of work with gender with Sarah Connolly, who is the co-author of the presentation. And, I mean, what women have discovered is that, surprise, surprise, when you put women in the room, the problems that they consider to be agenda-worthy solutions they provide are really important. Same is true of nationality. And I talked about Helena, I can't remember the name from Helena McNamara from COVID. If you remember, I mean, that was just such a really clear illustration of what happens when you have only men in the room. You have women, female genders included. Okay, so that's the point about representation. There is diversity, and this is partly why I mentioned the small and large state, because I think a lot of the issues are going to dissolve in that way. Clearly, we're not talking about a coherent block. What we did when we did our first project, I mean, the leadership of the institution was really interested to know how the incomers were settling in, what the officials from the EU 15 thought of them, and it was a big question. But by the time we got to the second project, no one really cared. They were just, and in fact, I mean, what was really interesting about mixing survey, here's advocacy for mixed methods for you. The survey is quite sort of, blunt and brutal, because you're shoving people answers. In interviews, people say, "Look, it's fantastic having that Estonian or Polish person who speaks sort of, 6 or 7 different languages, young and enthusiastic." All that is really important. So in the third survey, we didn't even ask about this. It's just ceased to be an issue, I think, in the commission. There's an anthropologist whose name, unfortunately, I can't remember, who thinks otherwise. His study is based on a rather small number of case studies. So I don't take that very seriously necessarily. On the point about influence, well, I mean, this is always the sort of million-dollar question in politics, and I think that when we discover who was what and what the outcomes were, we do this by process tracing sort of meticulously. But we know that small countries have had important influence on particular issues. I mean, think about Ireland and Brexit. The rumour was Declan Kelleher, Prime Rep of Ireland, was hiding in the cupboard in the task force room. And we know that there was a huge diplomatic effort, unprecedented Irish diplomatic history, and that they were really the sort of shapers. As has just been sort of said by the last speaker, small countries are have to be selective. So I'll offer another example. I mean, one of the things I was really sort of quite shocked by is how, if you're a small member state, you can't go to every meeting. You can't send representatives to all meetings. I mean, I remember someone from Irish firm representing to me 20 years ago, so it might not hold anymore. Well, of course, we don't send reports back like the British because the secretary's not at 5 o'clock. And I was thinking, wow, would I like to be an Irish person and know that the system that isn't operated because of that? And then when a project on the European Competition Network, a lot of the Baltic states did not send representatives to the meetings because they didn't have the staff, they didn't have politics. And so there are limits, but I still think you can identify influence. And of course, digital citizenship is a really, really great example.
Excellent, thank you.
Sorry, can I just say one other
yes,
thing?
of course.
So this is probably self-interested with me. That last question you said about national coordination. I did a couple of volumes in 20 years ago. And we're revisiting that with all 30 member states. Sorry, all 27 member states, plus Switzerland, Norway, and the UK. How do you influence the? So it's basically what is the system, what is the approach, what are you trying to influence, what are your coordination ambitions, so on. So that'll be out sometime next year.
Wonderful. Zselyke?
Thank you. Yes, just I think 2 points. One is on policy influence. The question on policy influence. I think what wasn't mentioned is that an obvious area is enlargement. Like this used to be the traditional area where most of these countries have had or could have had some impact. And already for the Polish presidency, this is a priority, the kind of knowledge sharing, skill sharing, that is already taking place. So that's an obvious example of policy influence. And then just another point on Hungary, just going back to Hungary, I think because the first speaker said that Hungary is an outlier, I think I mean, I very much agree with Kristi otherwise that the region is very diverse, and I was glad to hear how the Baltics doesn't necessarily group itself with Central and Eastern Europe in this respect anymore. I think that's an important development, but still, I think it would be too early to just say that Hungary is an outlier. I mean, it wasn't long ago when Poland was an outlier too, and we don't see how developments will evolve in Slovakia for now. It seems like it will be perhaps an outlier as well. So I just wouldn't count Orbán out also because of his skills at networking and building coalitions at the level of the EU. And especially if and when enlargement happens, with Serbia, for example, that is an obvious country where Orbán has been building networks, but also in North Macedonia, where the previous government is now back in power. So I would just caution. I mean, I would say that unfortunately this trend is not going away.
Thank you, and we can have another quick round of questions. David?
Thank you, Andy. David Madden, European Studies Centre. Very quick one. Does the fact that Germany has opted to play rather a low-level role in the EU, does that complicate the any desire on the part of the Central and Eastern Europeans to play a bigger role?
More questions? Yes, please.
Thank you so much for the speakers' interesting insights. And I'm a master student from OSGA. I was wondering, in the context of the East-West divide, how does this what's the influence of the EU's strategic autonomy nowadays? Because it could be seen a cohesion or cohesive actions for the EU's strategic autonomy, but in this context, maybe there's some influence, negative or. Thank you so much.
Excellent. More questions? Okay, so we have the first question from David about Germany's position and taking not a particularly active role. To what extent this is having an impact on incentivizing discussion or more input from Central and Eastern European member states. And the question that we have is, what are the implications of East-West divide on EU strategic autonomy? Mihail?
Joking answer to your question. So in the European Parliament, they have the least power. So if you look at the nationality of these office holders, committee group coordinators, chairs, the most powerful nationality is of course German. So at least as far as the Parliament goes, the Germans are still very, very prominent. But I do see the sense of your question broadly about the government.
So I make the same argument to the Commission. I think the fact that the fact that it is von der Leyen, who is a proactive, energetic, and NATO networked person, that makes a real difference. She's got credibility in Washington that her predecessors haven't had a stature. And I think that one cannot escape from the fact that the German Chancellor is been marking kinds of domestic sort of problems, but you do have her energy and ability to sort of not just set the agenda, but sort of devise solutions that's somehow acceptable to many national capitals. So I think that's the avenue through which you'll see German influence.
And Csaky, Kristi, would you like to I also mentioned address the last two questions, Csaky?
Yes, just one quick point on strategic autonomy. I think Tusk just very recently came out strongly in favor of strategic autonomy, but as was mentioned previously, a lot will depend on what happens with Germany and what happens with France, because without those two countries, there isn't that much that Poland could do in this regard on its own. And right now, it doesn't look like that political developments domestically are favorable either in France or in Germany for a stronger role in the near future.
Thank you.
For the good questions on strategic autonomy, I could give a whole lecture on the views of the Eastern member states, but very briefly, I mean, initially when France came out strongly with this notion on the EU agenda, it was seen as counterproductive in the Baltic states and Poland. And I would say the most important reason was, I would word it in such a way that the problem was that the French notion of strategic autonomy kind of ignored the most serious security threat for the Baltic states and Poland, which was Russia. But the way France was talking about strategic autonomy, it was about all sorts of other issues, but it actually did not address the question of Russia. And partly it was because there was kind of agreement that, okay, this was left to NATO, it was about collective defense, NATO was responsible for that, but it still then left us with the question of how can we speak about strategic autonomy then if the EU does not address in any way the issue of defending member states against Russia. But this changed, this is one of the things that changed with the full-scale war in Ukraine. And now a lot of the things that the EU is doing in the field of security and defense actually do strengthen Europe's ability to manage the Russian threat. And I think the division of labor between NATO and EU is clear, but what the EU can bring to strengthening Europe's capability to deal with its own security and defense, it's very important. And now there is a much more like shared view among member states about what does it mean? What do we mean when we talk about strategic autonomy? Europe needs to become more capable to take care of its own security and defense. And that's where the EU should do more. And it's quite interesting that Estonia in particular has become one of the most proactive countries in this field and really pushing the EU to do more on defense, which is quite different from the previous agenda of Estonia, where it was kind of lukewarm, kind of actually wanting the EU to do as little as possible almost because it was not seen as a priority. And the way, again, I mean, the way the strategic autonomy was understood was different in different capitals. But then on Germany and France, I don't think any member state can be happy about it if there is like lack of leadership in Germany or in France. For the EU to be capable of taking decisions and bringing forward any policies, you need to have these two biggest countries on board. And when they are paralyzed or when they are not delivering, it's not enough then to have some smaller member states being very, very proactive. Germany is really, of course, a question mark now, and it's really a huge problem for the EU that it is not able to deliver on many issues. France has its own problems, but just one interesting dynamic in the past few years is that France has been clearly reaching out more to the Eastern member states and has really made an effort, and its positions on security and defense related issues have become much closer to those of the Baltic states. And in Tallinn, we sense it very clearly, this increased interest and outreach and effort of the French to kind of discuss with the Baltic states and to kind of cooperate in bringing different issues forward on the EU agenda.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristi. I think that I will just basically abuse my position with the closing and concluding remarks and address some of the questions that we've had before that. I mean, I don't think that anyone here would argue that Eastern Europe is the same basically entity. We all highlight the significance and the importance and how diverse this region is. I think the aim with the broader network that we have established on Rethinking Europe's East-West Divide is perhaps trying to move away from the stereotypes and the cliches that have been relatively often used to study Central and Eastern Europe as a region to which something is done on a regular basis, and their agency has been broadly raised from the academic literature as well as from the policy debates. We have seen the significance of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and I'm glad that Kristi mentioned France. We've had quite a dramatic opportunity to listen now to the concerns and issues and policy priorities of Central and Eastern European countries, because clearly they have raised them repeatedly over the last 2 decades, but they have been ignored for quite a long period of time. So I think that that's why there is an important shift. And this has clear implications for who will have the power to shape the next policy agenda, how problems will be framed, and what will be the policy solutions that will be devised to deal with these problems and challenges, and ultimately recognizing the very much varied and important agency of Central and Eastern European countries and how they can shape positively or negatively European integration, but just basically having a discussion about the agency and the broader significance about the balance of power in the European Union. And obviously we've acknowledged that without France and Germany, nothing can happen, but also it's important to recognize that reputation matters, particularly when we have small member states, in terms of their ability to build coalitions to advance policy priorities and to shape the future of European integration. I mean, this has been a very, very insightful and interesting conversation. I would like to thank again our speakers, and I will invite you to join me as well in a final round of applause. And thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Csaky and Kristi, for joining us online. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.